Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second webinar in our series. Are we on, Nick? Yes, we are. The second webinar in our series of looking at artists as workers, a new study released by Macquarie University and supported by Creative Australia. I'm Georgie McClean. I'm the Executive Director of Development and Partnerships here at Creative Australia. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are joining today here at the Creative Australia offices in Pyrmont on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to the elders of that community and recognise their long-standing custodianship of this place and long history of storytelling. And of course, recognise the elders of all the many communities we're all joining from this afternoon. I'm joined today by the authors of this fabulous report, which is we actually have with us, hot off the press with us this afternoon, Professor David Throsby and Katya Petetskaya, who is both a research program director and a performer and visual artist, joining us again as we dive deeper into the findings of the research and the implications of that research. I'm here by the wonders of technology with some colleagues in the room as well, Director of Research Rebecca Mostyn and Anita Strezova, Research Program Manager, who have been stewarding this work and have authored the companion report to that this phenomenal tome. I'm also joined to help us dive deeper with some very special guests this afternoon. We have with us Vidya Rajan, who is a multi-talented artist and performer. She's a digital artist, a writer, a theatre performer and comedian. She's an Augie-winning screenwriter for The Feed, At Home Alone Together and Auntie Donna's Coffee Cafe. She's a comedian whose work I can highly recommend, having seen it myself in Darwin some years ago. And she famously scraped the web for her own data and created a bot of herself. But I think we have the OG Vidya with us this afternoon. Excellent. Wonderful. Good to have you here with us, Vidya. Thank you. I'm also joined by David Sharp, who's a management and business consultant specialising in creative and digital industries companies, who's also formerly worked at Australia Council, the predecessor to Creative Australia. So welcome, David.
Thank you.
And finally with us, we have Louise Buckingham, the CEO of the Arts Law Centre of Australia. She's a lawyer and academic who specialises in intellectual property and human rights, both very salient topics for this discussion. And for those who don't know, Arts Law provides legal advice and information on arts-related legal and business matters, including contracts, copyright, business structures, defamation, insurance, employment and taxation to artists and arts organisations across all art forms. So welcome, Louise.
Thank you very much.
So this is a really significant study. For those of us who joined us for our first webinar last Tuesday on the 7th of May, as we launched the research, we did a bit of an intro to that, and we'll drop into the chat a link to that webinar that goes through the core findings of the research. Our opportunity today is to dive a little deeper into the implications of this work. And obviously the study that we're drawing on draws from data from pre-National Cultural Policy. So it's 2021, 2022 data, which gives us a really interesting kind of baseline and perspective on the arts as they were prior to the launch of the National Cultural Policy. And in some ways, we've been saying it gives us a picture of the problems we're currently trying to solve. I might start with David and Katya to talk a little bit about those problems. David, if I may start with you, this is confusing. I better say Professor David, David Throsby, if I can start with you. What do you see as some of the biggest threats and warning signs for the future of Australian artist populations that emerge from this data? Where do you feel there's some concerns?
Well, look, there are a couple of things that one would have to draw attention to looking ahead. I think the first one that I would draw attention to is in a sense nothing new. It's the same thing that's always been the case, and that is the difficulties of sustaining a career as an individual artist, whatever the art form. It goes right across the board. In difficult times, and of course the difficult times have been exacerbated by the advent of COVID in recent years, but also by the fact that artist expenditures have been going up. Everybody's affected by cost of living rises now, as we know, and it's a big problem. Artists are particularly affected. Their costs have been rising more quickly than other groups, and that's something which is putting even more of a squeeze on the fact that they still are trying to eke out enough to be able to make a living. And we always find that the biggest constraints on being able to do more creative work in the arts is an economic constraint the work isn't available, the return is not enough, and they're just not able to do it. That's the first thing I'd say. And in a sense, as I said, that's sort of more or less the same as before. There are a couple of things that come out of this particular survey that are concerning. One is the return to COVID from after COVID is looking encouraging, but still there's quite a long way to go yet. There's still quite a number of artists who haven't been able yet to be able to resume their level of working, the time allocation to the creative arts that they had before COVID. And although some have, there are quite a number who are still in the process of getting back, and even a minority, about 16% we found, who think that they won't be able to go back at all. And COVID has really, in a way, dealt a death blow for them. And the other thing I'd say is that in some art forms, there are sort of bigger warning signs than others. And I think musicians would be one case in point. We are all fairly familiar now with the fact that music festivals have been cancelled. And that's been a big problem for the individual musicians. So they have difficulties with that. They have difficulties also with continuing to deal with the streaming platforms, which they're up against, sort of fairly large interests in dealing with the streaming platforms. And that's something which is also putting a squeeze onto musicians' incomes. And so musicians that we've seen a decline in the numbers of musicians in the last survey compared to the one before. And I'm not sure that that's something that's going to continue indefinitely, but that certainly is something which I think rings something of a warning bell in that industry. And it's good to see that policy is trying to address some of this through particularly through Creative Australia and the music programs, including some that were announced in the budget on Tuesday.
Yeah, Revive Live announced on Tuesday night. Absolutely,
Yes.
David. And I guess that there is that kind of interrelationship, isn't there, between incomes and time to be able to do the work. So I guess that's in some ways they're one and the same story. That
Yes.
is seeing that really kind of worrying decline in numbers. We really don't want to see that continue. Katya, if I might draw you in now. So where do you see as some areas of opportunity for this work, and what could we build on as a sector from the findings that you've released last week?
Right. Well, I mean, there are some positive signs, and I think one of the most positive workforce becomes more inclusive. We have more artists non-English speaking background, or significantly more artists from disability joining arts scene. It's still below the average levels, but it's getting there. But what we can definitely build on, and I think the most exciting from this survey, the latest in 2023, we have gender pay gap is decreasing. So in 2016, we had across all incomes, it was 25%, now it's 19%. And most exciting news is actually like not all income, but artistic income. It decreased, it's 10% now, it's below the national average. This is something to celebrate. And it's also an opportunity, because if we think the same, artists also suffer penalty. Female artists suffer double penalty of being a woman and being an artist, but all artists suffer a penalty, income penalty as artists. So something worked in addressing the gender pay gap. Can we apply the same methods in improving situation for the artists? And that would be by increasing like pay transparency, maybe like encouraging more, promoting fair pay for artists, like increasing their representation in leadership positions, and also awareness. I mean, we could create more awareness of what's actually real costs for making art for artists, and what actually takes, how artistic labor, that make it more visible to the public, to the institutions. And so that's an opportunity. Another opportunity that come up from the report that we did, and it's definitely, and this David and I presented this in the case in the conversation article that was published last week. But as investors, and seeing the major investors in Australia, we could definitely also support them to do this. So I guess this is some encouraging news from what we've done. So, like, what the data game, like, tells us. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Katya. There was a little bit of a glitch at the end there. I think you were saying that artists are genuine investors in their own creative practice and their own professional development and in the creation of their own work, and that's something we can celebrate. In the spirit of that, I'd like to turn to one of our artists now, Vidya, if you may. Katya, you're also an artist yourself. We noted, of course, that artists are now working increasingly across art forms, and you're a case in point in that kind of practice. And you questioned my use of portfolio career for you the other day when we were chatting, but apparently that's what you have. And 65% of artists think technology will assist them to produce their work going forward and open up new creative opportunities for them. But of course, the cost to produce work has increased dramatically. So Katya was just suggesting that kind of raising that visibility of both artists' investment in that work and its value, but also kind of unpacking that process. What do you think are some of those the challenges that you'd like to make visible around kind of maintaining a career as an artist in Australia at the moment?
Oh, it's a huge question. Also, I'd never heard the term portfolio career, but I will be using it from now on. Yeah, I think it's sort of echoing what was said. To me, the biggest issue that I can feel, because I live it, is sustainability. And I think, as you've defined it, just how do you keep working at a level that also sustains your life and allows you some kind of future-proof ability as well. I think the risk of this changes depending on the background of the artist and the field they're in. I think right now there is this sort of recognition that multidisciplinary artists have some advantages, but I would say, like, even a few years ago when I was more an emerging artist, I think that kind of diffuse practice was looked down on, or had this very more classical model even in the sector of like what kind of art you specialize in. And now it's just a very big reality that you can't sustain stuff unless you're able to do that. Very few people can stick and paint one type of painting for like 50 years anymore, or to specialize in that. So yeah, and obviously for me, technology is a huge part of that, but I also think it's a part of anyone's practice now, just even in terms of how you are marketing yourself or how you make your work available to people. So just in a very production line sense, but for me, it's like an integral part of what my work investigates. So of course, it's going to be more dependent on that. Yeah, I think re-sustainability, it's the issue for me. Like, recently in Victoria, there was sort of a paid leave scheme for when artists were sick, sick leave scheme, which was great. And then it's been scrapped. There was like a pilot program, I think. And I think stuff like that would go a huge way to it. The superannuation guarantee is just a few years old now, I think. And not all institutions are still doing it, though it's illegal. But yeah, so it just, things like that, like these other labor conditions that could ease it even before we start getting to how should your practice branch out and how sustainable is that? Like just the kind of labor rights that most other professions and even most other contractors have, so that's a big thing for me. And yeah.
I'll go ahead, sorry.
Oh, just like just looping back to technology, I think, and you mentioned the pandemic, David, there was this huge pivot with a lot of institutions towards being, technology first, which I think created like really great opportunities for artists who were regional or had accessibility, things that they need to take into consideration, but also just for artists in general, and reached quite new audiences. And I do see a lot of that has fallen away. Some of that's just practical, why invest in that infrastructure when you can go back to live things. But I think, yeah, I'm kind of, it's often, held up as this way forward, but not without continued valuing of that as a equal stream of audience development and artist development. It's an add-on to a lot of things, unless the institution is explicitly looking at artists who work with tech art. So yeah, that's, yeah.
Thanks, Vidya. I guess that one of the findings of the report is that artists are extraordinarily agile and resilient and continually training. So taking on new skills and trying to adapt their practice. But of course, as you say, you need those foundational kind of those floors to your practice and that kind of foundational support to maintain. Of course, one of those is IP. And I'd like to turn to you now, if I may, Louise. So one of the findings of the report that was kind of new, and it was a substantial increase, is that we found that 30% of artists don't know if their IP has been infringed. And they express a lack of understanding of the regulatory settings that they're operating within. So 54% said they don't know if current copyright protections are adequate. So, I mean, I guess there's a question there. Do you think this is a bit about a particular lack of understanding of complex copyright law for amongst artists, or is it that the landscape is changing so fast that it's not possible to keep up for practitioners? What's your take on that kind of?
Yeah, I think both things for sure. And then it's also interesting that whilst artists don't know if infringement has occurred, there's sort of a general increase in awareness of the existence of the law. So in one way, that can be seen as a sort of positive trend, that the awareness generally is there. And then, of course, the real challenge is around understanding and that meaning something in practice too. And, I guess coming back to the budget and other related issues for organisations like Arts Law, it's super important that we exist and are funded in order to provide free and cheap legal advice to artists who may otherwise not have access to justice and to that kind of information, but also that we confront the realities of the complexity of the various regimes that are at play, and of course that's mostly copyright and moral rights, and the sort of data is mixed in terms of how useful that is, but the question of whether the law is is fit for purpose and not just fit for purpose but accessible and usable for intended recipients, who are producing the work that this the scheme is meant to encourage and incentivize. That's another question. So yeah, I think it's a lot of different factors at play. And technology, of course, is one thing and provides opportunities that Katya's pointed to, and Vidya as well. But it's also not something that all artists have access to, not just in terms of their practice, but also in terms of the law itself. And so it can be an opportunity, but also a bit of a hurdle, I would imagine, for some.
Absolutely. And it's quite a big one, I guess, for a lot of artists who aren't familiar with the whole landscape, right? It's a whole thing to sort of grapple with. Yeah. So it's really important to have resources like Arts Law.
That's what I was going to say. So pleasing to see allocation of budget for education around this, and also for the Attorney General's Department's specific copyright and generative AI focus, that hopefully will be with a view to creators and artists, rights being protected, and they're being sufficiently empowered to use the law. That is my hope for the focus there. So that's all heartening, but it's a big complex area.
Indeed, it sure is. I've been reminded by a colleague I should prompt for questions. We have some time at the end of this for questions from those joining us this afternoon. We obviously have quite a number of people joining us, upwards of 250, so we won't get to every question, but we'd love to have some questions from those dialing in. So please start dropping them in on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens that you can see there. Meantime, I'd like to ask you, David Sharp, if I may. One of the other findings of this report is that, most of our artists work in creative business contexts and have ABNs and obviously operate on a self-employed or freelance basis, but less than half believe they have the business skills they need to support their practice. 34% say they have inadequate or non-existing digital business skills, which is quite disturbing, given what we've just heard from Vidya about how essential that is to creative work. And 32% say they have inadequate or non-existent knowledge of arts-related government regulations, similar to what we've been hearing from Louise. So what do you think are the biggest challenges for individual artists to manage the business side of their practice, in your experience? And what would your recommendations be to sort of ameliorate that situation?
Well, I think there's a range of mixed data in there about how people feel about their business skills. And there's some areas where they feel relatively confident. And as the report also says, there's been more focus on business skills in arts training over the last few years as well too. So when you think about that context, it's a bit perplexing as to why artists' incomes don't go up over the course of the time frame covered by the surveys, and they sort of remain stubbornly low. And that leads me to think about the sort of business skills that we're talking about. And I've been, looking at the sort of skills that the survey talks about: financial management, contract skills, applying for funding, so on and so forth. There is a view that it could be that sort of maintaining business rather than growing business. And I think that if there's somewhere to sort of pivot that business skills training, it might be towards specifically about increasing incomes. And I think that comes back to a few basic skills around entrepreneurship. And certainly, in the work I've been undertaking with creative entrepreneurs, we know that this is a process which can be broken down and taught. It's not a sort of magical thing which some people can do and some people can't. But it requires a sort of focus on looking around for opportunities, gathering the resources to capitalize on those opportunities. And one of the other stats that jumped out for me in that particular business skills was that 44% of responders rated their sales skills as adequate, 26 as inadequate, and 2 as none. So you've got 72% of people there saying they're not confident about how to sell their own products. And I think that that's a challenge for some people. There's absolutely an identity conflict here between the creative and business side of people's practices. But it is somewhere where I think we could pivot that business skills training towards. And the other thing which came out for me by looking at these results and comparing what happened during the pandemic, where governments started to play around with what I'd call demand side interventions. So voucher schemes like the Dine and Discover vouchers here in New South Wales, the Creative Kids vouchers. This is not really an area in which government plays around very much. It tends to fund artwork and contribute to the supply side. If we could grow the demand more and sort of flip that occasion, then we would create an environment, I'd suggest, where there'd be more competition for artists' work, and so we could expect higher fees there as well. So I think it's more than just about providing more business skills training to artists. I think it's a bit more innovation and a bit more experimentation with how arts funding is delivered and what sort of initiatives we're focused on.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. I guess there's that kind of tension point. I mean, we were talking before, we heard before from Vidya's response, that idea of these platforms being really kind of a new world to navigate. And I guess when you sort of, a lot of the questions of growth rely on a sort of direct relationship to audience in some way, and a way through a pathway to market. So that some of those are getting more complex too. And I guess in the mix, how do we empower creatives to have that agency in that mix? We've had a few questions come through. Thank you so much, everyone who's put your questions in. The first I'd like to ask is one of David and Katya. So I might turn to you, David, first. David, if you've had any impressions about how the rise of generative AI has impacted on the results of the survey.
Yeah, look, we haven't picked that up directly because it's a bit too early in the piece really to be able to say too much about that. It's something which I think generally is of concern to artists and to the arts community generally. One of the things which we do know about artists is that, and particularly performing artists, is that the the live performance in the presence of the consumers is something which is sort of undeniable, and that won't be replaced by AI. But the generation of new work, as we know, through generative AI is something which is happening. I don't know yet that artists have really got to grips with this, as indeed has the rest of the community. It's something which is still in the process of developing. We're still working out exactly how to handle it in the broader community, and I think that artists are as much affected as anybody else. And I think it is going to be a concern in the future as to how the ownership of creative work, which is a problem for Louise, of course, in law, as to how that's going to be worked out, and that I think is still a completely open book.
Absolutely. Louise, did you want to respond to that?
I would love to, and that's but because I'm conscious that not bot Vidya, but actual Vidya has pointed to the use of such tools as being wonderfully positive and potentially creative and empowering, and of course they may be, and that is particularly so if the data that is part of training data and has been ingested or scraped from the internet and is then deployed by a creator is something that they control and know the source of origin of. But the big issue, of course, in terms of the impact on the efficacy of copyright law and moral rights law, and of direct consequence to creators as a result, is where the training data is in fact infringing content that and creators permission has not been sought, they've not been remunerated, rather their artistic output has been used completely without their consent, and the law that is intended to incentivize, encourage and protect artists and their output is undermined effectively. So whilst we have no sort of safeguards and guardrails around that side of things, and keeping in mind the incredibly sort of the imbalanced situation of artists as all of this data shows in comparison to big tech and the companies who are benefiting from ownership of the systems and tools that are doing this scraping and ingesting of data. It's something of incredible seriousness that I think we need to be thinking about. And as you say, people, it's hard to come to terms with, because the world we exist in terms of the legal landscape anyway is complex, and this just adds a whole other level of complexity to that. And of course, this relates to the data around moral rights and attribution, and artistic works not being treated in a derogatory sense. And of course, they may be if they are part of what is informing output that someone uses these tools for. And then there's, of course, also the question of whether or not the work that is produced or generated through these tools is even work in which copyright subsists or exists because of lack of discernible human authorship, which is a key pillar of the law. And what we have from the US Copyright Office so far in terms of explicit guidance on this question, and what our law says and copyright law around the world says, is that you need a human author for copyright to exist. And so the question of whether the tools are being used in a way that is akin to a paintbrush or a camera, and how much human input is involved in generating the content is an issue from that perspective. Because
could I just say, in briefly to add to what I was saying before, instead of being entirely sort of sounding warning signs, I think we could also say that artists have always used technology, and generative AI is just another step along the way. And I think there are all sorts of ways in which it could be used for creative purposes, with the full knowledge of the artists. And I think that's something which we can.
That's the key. So long as artists aren't being ripped off and empowered, there's a way for people whose work is used to be remunerated and to be in control and to give their consent around the use, then everything's fine. So the bot that one makes oneself is probably an okay thing from this perspective. Yeah, the other issue for creators, of course, is that whilst there's ambiguity around whether or not the output from the tools is, something in which copyright exists and that someone owns, it may be that it's exploitable by anybody and sort of not protectable by the person who thinks they've created it as well. So this is where we need clarity as well in the
whole different system of thinking.
Whole different thing. Yeah.
I just
add something
Yeah.
quickly.
Oh.
Here. I think
Sorry,
I think
David, if I can go to Vidya next, sorry.
Oh, it's okay. No, I was gonna say, yeah, we're talking about like whether you have IP in something and, fair use can result from that. But I think, and a lot of artists are already feeling this, there's this broader issue that could be solved legislatively or through policy of, not, so local council recently had a marketing campaign and the images were AI generated. That work could have gone to an artist. You could tell, so it wasn't great quality. So it's just things like that where like, are there minimum guarantees of like how much work you're allowed to source out? Like there are policy barriers you could create this way. I know it's like slightly a Luddite argument, but it's I think it's also, this will happen more. A lot of these tools have huge environmental impact. So there's also sustainability there. So how much, do especially government organizations and such want to be contributing to that, if you're doing your green offsets in a different way. So there's other issues here that aren't there with traditional tools as well. Yeah, so I think there's something, the AWG, for instance, has like, so anyone who's a guild member is a guild approved production screenplays, for instance, can't use AI in them. And so like there are policy things here around the labor of artists and the sustainability we're talking about, quite apart even from the IP issue. Yeah.
Sorry, David?
I was just my point was about the labour stuff, and actually my point is this has already started happening, and it's impacting on entry-level positions in the arts. So while for self-employed artists, there are actually a whole lot of benefits using generative AI to create work. Actually, for those looking for employment, and if you think about entry-level writing, session musicians, voiceover artists, in animation, there's a whole lot of tasks there which have started to disappear. And I've heard it from businesses saying, actually, we've discovered we don't need our juniors anymore. And so I think where this relates back to business skills is actually in that metric you highlighted, Georgie, around digital business skills. We actually have to start training graduates around how they can use AI to position themselves in the workforce in a way which makes them the drivers and the prompters and the runners of these things, rather than the substitutes for these things.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. And I must say there's quite a few more questions, but I'm very conscious we are at, and in fact, over time, although we did start a little late with a tech glitch. I'd like to encourage everyone who didn't get their questions answered this afternoon, if they'd like to send in an inquiry to the researchinquiries@creative.gov.au email address, which I think we're going to drop in the chat. I'd like to thank all of our guests today. I feel like we could keep talking for another 4 hours, particularly as the AI Pandora's box has been opened, which is always a big one and a really, really hot topic at the moment. But I'd really like to thank all of you for sharing your generous insights with us this afternoon. There's so much to discuss out of these findings. And of course, thank you again to David and to Katya for producing this extraordinary kind of tome that we get to mine for years to come, and that gives us such a really important foundational understanding of our artists in Australia, such a wonderful kind of community who contribute so much. So thank you. Of course, the full report is available on our website alongside a much briefer companion report that is compiled by the research team. And it's also accompanied by dashboards of the data. So you can hop on there and engage directly with the data, which is fantastic. I'd like to thank all of our guests and our Auslan interpreters, Rebecca and Claire, for their extraordinary work. We have been dealing at pace with some big concepts, so thank you so much. And thank you all again for joining us this afternoon. There's much to discuss, and these policy conversations and the implications of this research will continue to be mulled over by many of us across the sector. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.